Hi everyone, welcome to Wandering DMs. I'm Paul.
And I'm Dan, and today on Wandering DMs, we have very special guest, Mr. Michael Moorcock, who, if you don't know, is a legendary fantasy and sci-fi author. He's an editor, musician. He's the winner of about every award and seminal writers list that we care about. So, Michael, thank you so much for making time to join us today.
Thank you. Glad to be here.
I'll say that for if you're watching live today on Sunday, we do have the YouTube Super Chat facility available. So if you have a hot question that you really want to get into Michael today, we'll try to prioritize that during our live show. But we have a whole bunch of questions ourselves, so we might possibly dominate the hour here.
And I'll do my best to remember whatever it is I have to remember.
So, Michael, let me start with this. So, my understanding is you hold to a very regimented writing process. So, maybe you could share a little bit about what you're working on right now for your next piece.
Well, I'm not quite as regimented as I used to be, but I'm still pretty. I tend to these days. I mean, what I used to do is I set myself 15,000 words a day, and I could do it on a manual typewriter. But these days, I'm not quite as fast as I used to be, and I tend to set it at about 1,000, 2,000 words a day. Partly because the writing is probably a bit more. Well, the subjects certainly are a bit more complex, and it just takes longer to think through. What I'm doing at the moment is the last novel in a series called the Chronicles. I think it's called the Chronicles of the White Friars, and which is a very strange mixture of fantasy adventure, alternate world adventure, and absolutely straight memoir, as truthful as I can make it. And I don't think that's been done before. So I've never read anything quite like it anyway before. So it's a bit hard to work out a structure for it, as well as as well as everything else. I used to say that trying to reach a finale, it was like you were trying to tune 1,000 strings at the same time. That get every string in sync, and that's really what's happening, because particularly if you're not writing a linear story, this is a non-linear story, you have to make sure that the resonances are right, and that the reader at the end feels that they've actually got a finale, even though it isn't a slam bang ending, with a lot of people running about and killing one another. Although I do have some of that. So it's what it is with me is that I tend to I'm very easily bored, and I also feel that in order to keep vitality in a new book, because I'm 84 and I've written God knows how many, I really ought to set myself a harder task every time I do something, because that's what gives vitality to the early books. Because I was then at that point, I was trying to learn basically how to write a novel. But then as I went on, I've tried to just set the bar a little bit higher every time. It's a bit like being an athlete. Although it's a bit like being an 84-year-old athlete, which isn't so funny.
That's fascinating. Do you find yourself? Do you feel very critical now of your earlier works because you've been raising the bar for such a long time?
No, because it's very simple. Because I haven't read them. I almost never reread my books, but for some reason, the main characters, like Elric and Coram and so on, they stay in my head as characters, as people. So I never felt. I mean, I do have an assistant. I suppose you call him an assistant. I mean, as a friend of mine, John Davey, who is actually an editor, and John looks over, what I've written. For instance, the most recent Elric book, he'll check to make sure that I haven't, made any mistakes of time and place, that sort of thing. But generally speaking, I seem to be able to do it without needing to reread anything. I don't know quite why that is. It's a bit like a dream, but it's for some reason those characters are so firmly fixed in my head, or that they're familiar. It's as if they're people I know. So it's not difficult to write another book about a serious character. And of course, I bring in other characters all the time, and I'm bringing those characters into other stories and so on. So it's essentially one big novel that I'm trying to write. And this will be, I think, pretty certainly the last book last novel that I write. I think I'm going to stick to short stories and novellas after this, because I'm not getting any free time.
Michael,
sorry.
I wanted to ask specifically about this, actually. So in your long legacy of writing, I wonder about these, because as a writer, you started off writing short stories and novellas, and then you progressed to novels. And I wonder, from a professional author's point of view, I'm always curious about, like, which one is most satisfying. If you could just take the market forces entirely out of the picture, what would be more rewarding for, like, length? A short story or a novella or a novel or something bigger?
Well, a novel or something bigger. I mean, because I tend to write in sets of 3 or 4. So yes, it's for me that's so. But I know a lot of writers who prefer the short story length. From my point of view, I started with short stories, and then I worked my way up to novellas. I mean, this is a very conscious thing that I was doing. And then from novellas, I worked my way up to novels. And I tended to do it in certain lengths. I mean, not strict lengths. Although the Hawkwind books, for instance, were all done to exactly the same length. Every manuscript ends on exactly the same page as the previous one, and I wrote that in a very, very disciplined way. I mean, they took me 3 days each, so I didn't have that much time to do them in. And at that time, it was largely a financial reasons, because I was writing comics, and comics paid a lot better than the novels at that time, for me.
Really?
So I only had 3 days in the working week, in which to write the novel. The rest of the time, I was actually writing features, comics. I mean, I was a working journalist, really. So that's my career is somewhat different from most people's, and it's why I don't tend to use it as an example. People ask me to if I'll come and do a teaching course or that sort of thing, and I won't, because I don't believe that my experience is the same as other people's experience. What I did do was I wrote a book called "Death Is No Obstacle," which was about technique, and in it I wrote it was a question and answer. I mean, there was another guy involved, Colin Greenland, and Colin would ask me questions about how I solved a problem. Then I would answer how I'd solved that problem myself. But that's not to suggest that anyone else should solve it that way. But it does give you, should you want to, should it work for you, you can look at the example, and use it yourself if you want to. But I've never believed in teaching writing. I just don't believe you can. I think all you can do as an editor is show people how to bring the best out of themselves.
It's fascinating, because that's absolutely in line with my experience taking creative writing classes in college. The very first thing my instructor told me is, I can't teach you how to write. I can just give you the space to practice and the feedback on how you did.
Yeah. Yeah, and models too. I mean, you know how in an art gallery you'll sometimes see a bunch of students sitting around sketching a Rembrandt or something like that. It's the same. I've always said there's nothing wrong with imitation. To copy somebody else's plot that you like. I mean, I copied a Joseph Conrad plot, not a very outstanding Conrad, because I wasn't up to that. But I took a pretty bad Conrad and copied that for a book called The Ice Schooner, and in that I was trying to learn how to work character and action in together, which Conrad was very good at doing. So so there's nothing wrong with learn with copying either. I don't think. I mean, I don't think.
Cool.
As long as you don't copy too close, then it becomes plagiarism. Sorry.
I think I got advice like that from my creative writing instructors, actually. So one thing I got to ask, Michael, that our viewers, when our viewers heard that you were going to be on, I think the top thing they wanted to know is, as huge fans of Elric and the Eternal Champion, things like that, they've been waiting for decades for an Elric movie or TV series or video game, and they're wondering why has that not occurred at this point? And are you open to it, or why is that not happening yet?
I'm open. I have been open to it in recent years because the technology has caught up with the storytelling. In the past, the story depended on what Ray Harryhausen could do, which is usually skeletons. And since, say, Lord of the Rings, we've had a technology which has increasingly got better and cheaper. So it's possible to tell the story without the effects getting in the way, as it were, using the effects to help tell the story. So that's when I started saying yes to producers. And I've had, I think, three lots of producers who've tried to bring it to the screen, or at least the Eternal Champion, either one or the other, plus other stories of mine, like Behold the Man. I've had, I think, about 5 different lots of people. And usually it's the money at the end that can't understand the story. It's as simple as that. It's too complicated for them, and they're not sure whether how much they've got to invest, or where, it's all the usual sorts of things. So I think that's probably what it is mostly, why it hasn't happened. There's been plenty of enthusiasts who wanted to do it. And at the moment, it's in the hands of David Goyer, who is a very successful film and TV producer and writer and director. And there's a good script, very good script that his partners, he and his partner have done. So I'm hoping that that something will come of it, but I'm beginning to think that maybe not before I die. I probably won't. It'll probably have to be my ghost that goes in and into the theater and sees the movie. Because I always used to say that a movie that a movie, I've had 1 or 2 movies, of course, in the past, but. The movie isn't made until you can actually pay for a ticket and go in and see it, in the theater, or these days stream it on TV or whatever. That's when it's real. Up to that point, until it's had audiences, it's not real.
We are all hoping. I mean, we're all hoping for that to happen a lot sooner.
Yes,
we all want to see it actually live.
Actually. I've had a lot of option money. I've probably had more option money, than I would have earned if a film had been made. But there you go. It's one of those things.
What a wild industry, really. All right.
It is.
Crazy. So let me dig into something about the Elric stories that has been super influential to us and later writers. Is in the Elric stories in Eternal Champion, you have this moral alignment system of the characters are either serving the gods of law or the gods of chaos or the cosmic balance. And I think that some of the conversations we see nowadays is that maybe younger people, or the way the culture has evolved, some people have become uncomfortable with those kinds of binary Manichaean categories. For example, like the culture of Melniboné, the whole culture being aligned to chaos magic and Eric and things like that. Looking at it now, do you think that device, that law versus chaos device, stands up as a device for fiction, or would you want to evolve it or modify it in some ways nowadays?
Well, I mean, it has modified over the years. In the very early stories, I wasn't very clear on myself on what I was writing. So law tended to be good and chaos tended to be bad. I mean, tended to be, and then very quickly I evolved the idea that neither was good nor bad. It, depended on their effect. And I don't think you can really stop modifying that, because it's that kind of it's naturally complicated. And I've also brought in the multiverse idea, which is a very complex, fairly complex mathematical idea as much as anything. And so that the idea of self-similarity, sort of looking at Mandelbrot and and his ideas, has helped me expand the nature of law and the nature of chaos. So so now you can have a very good person who's serving chaos, or a very bad person who's serving law, and I think that's exactly how it's only an attempt to mirror what the real world is like. I mean, you can have plenty of people who appear to be villains to one side, say. I think Napoleon's a very good example of that. I mean, you can't say anything bad about Napoleon in France, whereas you can say anything you like about Napoleon in England. I mean, but it's because that's how it went. It's not quite the same with Hitler. I mean, Hitler, most people agreed, probably didn't do very much ultimate good. But a lot of people have done, and I tend to see these days. I tend to see law as a repressive, more as of a repressive idea, and chaos more as a creative idea, and more to do with freedom, liberal virtues, if you like. So it's I mean, it's up to people how they see these things, and it's particularly up to people how they use those things. But that's, for me, it hasn't limited me. Put it that way. I've been able to expand pretty much constantly, along with my waistline. But we won't go into that.
I like your reference to mathematical ideas in informing your multiverse. I actually do. I'm a college professor of math for my day job, is what it is.
Oh, good,
so
yeah.
I knew there was something. I knew there was something about the Elric stories that really hooked me in. That among others. So it sounds like do you think that the moral ideas in your books actually illuminate the real world, or are they just purely just a narrative device?
I hope they illuminate the real world, but I can't say that they do. For instance, the Elric books to me are pretty straightforward morally, but there have been at least 2 cases where people have used those books, or said that they use those books, to commit murders. I mean, I've had lawyers get in touch with me and say, can you say something good about this guy? And normally I say no, let them swing, because I mean they've done some terrible crime and then pinned it on me, as it were. And I'm not too fond of people doing that.
Wow.
So anything can be used. The most divine ideas can be used to commit the most appalling atrocities. We all know that. I mean, that's the one thing we probably all learned from history. So I think that as far as I'm concerned, I'm constantly looking, at a complex moral world and trying to describe it as best I can in fiction. That's really. I'm looking at myself as well. I mean, particularly these most recent books, I've been, holding myself up for examination. Things that I've sort of taken for granted about myself and been a bit proud of myself for, if you like. But when I actually look, I think, well, maybe I wasn't too much on the right side of that particular incident, or whatever, things of that sort. So there's in that sense, there's if you like, a modernist look at self as well as the world itself. Although generally I'm looking at the, as in most science fiction and fantasy, I mean, that's one of its attractions for me, is you're looking at the outside world. You're not turned inwards. It's a lot of people, I think, these days believe that the interest in science fiction in particular was formed because people got a bit tired of authors navel gazing, if you like. Were looking too far inward, so that the entertainment value of the novel, which I think is important, however serious your intention, you still have to. Well, the reader still has to be considered, and the reader is in the end, the boss. So you have to, at least I have to do that. In that sense, I'm much more of a popular author than I am a literary author in modern terms.
Interesting. You've been writing enough that if I look back at the history of fiction, popular fiction, in the last number of decades, you've been writing enough that you've seen the split between what we now fantasy and science fiction become firmer over time. Has that? My understanding is that at an earlier point, I think when I first started going to bookstores, that was all part of one section of the bookstore, and then it became this more rigid separation between the two. Mm-hmm. Have you been surprised by that, or troubled by that, or do you like it, or wish that hadn't happened?
When I first started writing the Elric books, the publisher was very reluctant to put fantasy on it anywhere, because at that time fantasy was pretty much regarded as children's fiction, and which is why Ballantines, for instance, started putting adult fantasy on their adult fantasy series years ago. It was a reaction to that. So I think the first book of mine, it says SF in big letters and then fantasy in smaller letters on the front. So it took a while for people to accept what we now think of as adult fantasy. Although it existed, people would lump it in with science fiction, and so everything was science fiction. Since about 1990, maybe, it's hardened up. I mean, it's booksellers doing it. It's just they tend to think that readers are less flexible than often readers are. And I've always been for putting books in under authors rather than categories, because we do tend to do that. We have authors we like, and they can be, well, a whole range of different authors, different subjects. So I would rather also, when you do that, you get some very strange things. I was just writing about this the other day. A friend of mine was a great fan of Forrester, C.S. Forrester, who wrote the a series of naval adventures during the Napoleonic Wars, and he'd never read really a literary book in his life. I mean, he never thought that he wanted to, but he in the library by accident he took out a couple of E.M. Forster's books, and suddenly he finds himself reading E.M. Forster and enjoying it. And it seems to me that's when you start limiting what the categories, then people are never really going to find the whole, or rather, it's going to be harder for them anyway to find the whole expanse of fiction that they enjoy. Because I'm speaking personally, I enjoy a vast amount of different kinds of fiction. I do like fantasy, but it has to be very good and well written and so on. And of course, mostly with genre, you tend to get a lot of dross because publishers think, oh, that books about elves playing football are very popular. So suddenly you get 500 books about elves playing football, and it's an unfortunate tendency. I don't think we'll ever do anything about it, but it is an unfortunate tendency that happens every time. So,
speaking of other authors, or go ahead. Speaking of other authors that we may or may not like, right? So one of my favorite things of yours that you're kind of famous for is I have a copy of your Wizardry and Wild Romance essays on writing, including your pretty famous essay, Epic Pooh. And my understanding is you met Tolkien at one point, and Epic Pooh is a fairly critical take of Tolkien's work. Looking back at it, and you wrote it at a fairly young age, I think. Looking back at it, do you think that critique still stands up, or anything you'd change or add now, looking back at Tolkien?
No, I wouldn't change my attitude because I'm not attacking Tolkien really. What I'm discussing is I suppose I'm at least putting myself at odds with people who believe that Tolkien is the be all and end all of writing. Because I see Tolkien as being part of a group of writers, or rather having the ethos, if you like, of a group of writers who came up after the First World War. And there's a tremendous amount of nostalgia in that as people try to explain the reasons for so many people dying. I mean, we didn't need that explanation in the Second World War. I mean, there's a lot of good reasons for us stopping Mussolini and Hitler and Hirohito, but in the First World War, of course, it was just a bunch of imperial armies fighting one another, and it was no surprise that, for instance, America didn't want to get involved in that war because they could see it as a series of imperial wars. I think that nostalgic, bittersweet sort of feeling that you got in lots and lots of novels of the day between, say, 1920 and 1940, and some afterwards too, were, if you like, affected or infected by that rather desperate need to justify sacrifice, and so really, I mean, you've read the book, and I don't actually attack Tolkien as such. I'm talking about what I don't like about Tolkien. Now, that's not the same thing as saying Tolkien's a bad writer, or Tolkien's this, or Tolkien's that. He was an extremely nice man. I mean, certainly to me, he was a bit vague, but nonetheless, and I don't know why. I don't think he did either. Know why I was there. because somebody found a copy of a letter that I'd sent to Tolkien before I saw him, and it says, "Dear Professor Tolkien, I'd like to come and talk to you about your books." And then I go on to say, I haven't actually read any of them yet, which I hadn't. But I knew that he was an important writer because everybody was saying so. Not everybody. There was only about 8 people saying it at the time, because he was again. People were trying to explain Tolkien as post-apocalyptic, just as they were with Mervyn Peake and Gormenghast. They couldn't actually get the idea of a made-up universe or world. So anyway, so as far as I was concerned, I had nothing personal against Tolkien or C.S. Lewis. It was Lewis who gave me Tolkien's address to write to him in the first place. In those days, there were so few people interested in that kind of fiction that the camaraderie was closer, and there was no sense that if you gave Tolkien's address to somebody, he wouldn't he'd get a million letters the next day, or a phone call from Wisconsin saying, in the middle of the night, saying, "I really like your books, and why did Frodo do this," as it were, which in fact did drive Tolkien at the end of his life fairly nuts, and he even moved. I mean, he was sort of it was very much outside his world. And I think he saw me probably as being there as a sort of student or something. Somebody turned up to have a little lecture. I mean, I didn't get very much. He didn't really answer any of my questions. He just, kind of bumbled on for a bit and then said, "There's a very good train leaving at 6 o'clock. You might want to catch that," which is the usual way of offing some young lad.
Interesting.
So that's what happened. I mean, and so I had not, and it's just when I started to read it, it had the same quality to me as a number of books that I really didn't like because of that use of sacrifice and that elevation of sacrifice, which I think is not that good in terms of, even though I've done it myself. I mean, I'm not, it depends on the context. Everything depends on the context, and I just felt that was all I felt about Tolkien, and I put it in the book. Admittedly, probably more forcefully and less in a less complicated way than I would do now. I mean, I'd probably make a much more sophisticated argument.
I think that's fascinating. Fascinating. I was reading. I think I read a comic recently, where I think Hemingway, probably after being in limbo for a while, Hemingway shows up at the pearly gates, and he asks Saint Peter, "Can you tell me now who was the single most famous, influential writer of the 20th century?" And they mumble for a while, and then Hemingway says, "What's a hobbit now?" That's not what he surprised everybody.
Absolutely, yes, yeah.
So on that point, let me ask about another writer, right? So I think that you were one of the earliest people to be really heavily critical of H.P. Lovecraft for racist elements in his writings. And nowadays, since you first started vocalizing that, Lovecraft's in a lot of circles become completely persona non grata. And what used to be the H.P. Lovecraft Award got renamed, and a lot of places people really don't want to hear references to HPL at all. Do you think that that's gone too far, or do you think that's an appropriate reevaluation of Lovecraft?
I think it's gone too far, and I think ultimately it's probably not a huge number of people doing that. They just get heard loud. They're louder, and the newspapers can pick up on it more, quickly. There's a number of people in the world. I mean, I've known or felt this for many years, who simply like to be offended. And if they can be offended, it gives them identity. And if they, so that by being offended, they achieve identity if they haven't got much otherwise. And I think that's a lot of the problem with those ideas. I'm I I'm not I'm known for not being particularly right wing. So uh, I don't think I'm taking as it were, I'm defending racism, because of course I'm not. But I would never have gone so far as to banish Lovecraft from the literature, or not give people awards in his name and all the rest of it, all that stuff. I mean, I've got one. I think I've got a John W. Campbell Award, and I hated Campbell. But I mean, that wasn't the point of the award. Campbell was dead when they gave, when I got the award. It would, I just, it would just be silly to take offence in that way. I mean, I think it's gone too far. In short, as you said, or rather, not as you said, but as you asked.
Interesting.
I mean, I think the same. I mean, I'm not going to suggest that Tolkien be banned, because he hasn't got any brown people in his books. As far as I know, he hasn't. People, you can't blame people for being part of their own times. Well, you can blame them when they start putting it into action, like Hitler or somebody like that. But you can't blame people for being, for just being within their own times. But I think Lovecraft did go further, as did several other writers. I mean, Hemingway was not exactly philo-Semitic. I mean, you can go through pretty much every novelist in the modern American syllabus and probably find something, as it were, racist in that. But they were of their time. I mean, they those who are not of their time are remarkable, and there are some writers who are remarkable in that way. I think it's a matter of the how far you're prepared to step outside your times, as it were, that defines you on that particular issue. There are some very admirable writers who were not at all part of that, or rather, you say part of that. Sorry, what did you say?
Those are good thoughts. Let me ask this: you have, in your legacy, at times you've done, in addition to your very intricate multiverse ideas in your books, you've also welcomed other authors to use the same characters occasionally. Like you've had other authors use Jerry Cornelius and Michael Caine and things like that. And I feel like, my experience is that there was more of that shared universe DNA happening around the time of Lovecraft or Howard or, August Derleth or things like that. Do you think it's become harder or easier to share worlds with other authors over time?
Well, I think it's become harder because of the amount of legalism that's crept into literature in general. I mean, I used to, I'm at the moment I'm just putting together a special issue of New Worlds. In 20 odd years ago, all I needed to do was say to an author, "Thank you. We accept your story. First rights, magazine rights. And here's the check, as it were." And now you get a bloody contract that's several pages long, all of which, to me, is restricting and and it means that people have to be more and more careful, and everybody's copywriting everything, in their own names. Half of them, World of Warcraft, of course, doing it to Tolkien and me, but I mean it's certainly something that I think has come with the big movie companies taking over publishing companies. They've sort of shifted their whole modus operandi to include those long. I mean, a movie contract has expanded too. I mean, a movie contract's about that big now, whereas it used to be about 3 pages. It's just lawyers. Actually, I always said America was founded by a bunch of lawyers for a bunch of lawyers. I mean, there seems to be that that I can understand it. I mean, it's a good thing in the main. I'm not, but when it comes to the arts, I think it's not a particularly good thing. I don't know if
that's about what I would have guessed. Definitely, You definitely confirmed what my top fear was about exactly that. Is that the legal copyright trademark type issues have gotten more stringent over time, which is sad.
Yeah,
I enjoyed that explanation, and if it's harder, I think that's kind of sad from my perspective.
I agree. Yeah. I mean, I don't think Howard or Lovecraft or any of those guys were really thinking too strongly in trademarking their characters and selling the merchandise and all of that sort of thing. There wasn't any. I mean, it's the same reason I gave the game rights to of Elric, of the Elric stories. I gave them to Gary Gygax. I can't remember the firm's name. TSR. I gave them the rights. I also gave the rights to Chaosium because it didn't, if they at that time gaming was not particularly big, and I thought, well, yeah, sure, we're all in the same, basically in the same boat, rowing in the same direction. So by all means, have them. Then Chaosium sued Gygax for the rights. I mean, the whole thing was just ludicrous. So I tend to stay out of that as much as possible, and in fact keep my own agreements as simple as possible. But not quite as much as I used to. But you're right. I mean, certainly those guys. They didn't mind sharing characters, ideas, whatever. Same in the early science fiction days. I mean, people would flip back and forth between different ideas.
I'm fortunate to have an early copy of the Gygax's D&D book that has the Melniboné mythos and Elric in the book. And so this edition is considered pretty valuable because, for exactly the reason you're talking about, this got stripped out from the game later on. People kind of hunt around for this, and I'm kind of really fortunate to have a copy that does have Elric in it, as a matter of fact.
I had nothing against that. I mean, he could have kept that going forever. I mean, it's just that he chose not to fight, which is fair enough. I mean, it's his choice. And then, of course, Chaosium never paid me at the time.
Oh, no.
Which was the irony.
Oh dear.
To be fair, they're in other hands now, and they're doing a lot better. But I think it was Charlie Crank. I think it was, and he had the vision, but he didn't have the cash flow. I think is probably the fairest way of putting it.
That's hard to hear. That's really hard to hear.
It's changed now. I mean, I must say that things are a lot. They're a lot better for me actually than they used to be. I must say I benefited a little bit from from that, because now people are much more cautious about doing, say, a comic based on my characters. I tend to get a decent royalty for them these days, which is, I suppose, I must say that. Put it anyway. Let's keep
good.
moving.
That's good. All right. So I gotta ask about this. I have, speaking of comics, right? So I have a publication of Elric, Making of a Sorcerer, which was originally published in 4 issues here, and so it's got a credit here. It's from DC a couple of years back, and it's got your credit here, and also Walter Simonson. And I'm like, you're among my favorite writers, and Walter Simonson is among my favorite comic artists. And I honestly love this edition here, and I've reread it probably about 5 times at this point. But my understanding is you didn't have a very good working relationship with Walter Simonson, which really pains me to hear. Is that correct?
No.
Okay.
No, I've had a perfect relationship with Walter. I mean, ever since we began.
Okay.
I asked for Walter. I wanted Walter to do this. I mean, Walter and I thought it up together. We're good friends. I mean, it wasn't him. It was one other person in the multiverse comic that didn't do what I needed them to do, and I got irritated by that, because that was 3 stories which eventually merge and become one story. And because the guy wasn't drawing it as I asked him to draw it, it was making it difficult for me to bring the stories into sync. That was the only, and that wasn't Walter at all. Neither was it Mark Reed.
Okay.
So I mean, you can work out who it was. But no, Walter and I have got on tremendously well. I've known Walter since 1970 something, and Howard Chaykin as well. I mean, we've been friends for years. Chaykin did an Eternal Champion story too, which I think it says story by Howard Chaykin, which is not true. The story was by me, but I said to Howard at the time, because Howard was known for dashing off work a bit too quickly sometimes, so I said to him, I'll give you the story. You can have all the money as long as you do a really good, take time over doing it. He did a very good job, and I must say, and I don't think he took any longer, but he did a very good job. And now it says on the thing, story by Howard Chaykin, which it wasn't. So that's my only quibble at all. And I've certainly no quibble with Walter. I mean, Walter remains one of my favorite artists too.
I am so glad I asked about that. Apparently, I must have gotten bad information. And Michael, I am so glad I asked about that, because you completely filled me with joy to be corrected that you have a good working relationship between 2 of my favorite artists.
At some point, I've already done a YouTube with Craig Russell, but I'm going to be doing one with Walter. It's just been a question. Walter's been moving just recently, so it's going to be a little while before he settles down and we can do it. But we're planning to do a little interview, I think, on the Forbidden Planet channel sometime in the near future.
That would be great. That's great. I'm so glad you told us that.
Yeah, well, I'm glad I did. I'm glad you asked, really, because there's no question that Walter and I have got on famously, and I've really been pleased, very, very pleased with Walter's, what Walter's done.
It's one of among my favorite Elric works, frankly. So I keep rereading it over and over again. It's a great work. It really is.
Yeah, well, I'm glad. Yeah. Well, it's an actual addition to the Elric stories rather than an adaptation of the Elric stories, which I was glad to do. And we worked out a somewhat different background to the stories. So we were using more American Indian motifs than medieval English motifs, as it were, which I've always felt, we had a few too many of those in fantasy. Really, it's become almost part of the course that you have medieval villages and and castles and all that stuff. So glad to put it in for
I see that, and it feels very. I mean, for what it's worth, it feels very synthetic to the Elric mythos. And normally, I personally really hate prequels, frankly, and this is like one of the very few very successful, fresh prequels that I've ever read. Actually, so
most of the Elric stories are prequels, of course, because I killed him off in the second volume.
True. True. I have that. Yes, that's true. Spoiler alert, viewers. Spoiler alert. Yes, Elric does die off at some point early on. Yeah. Also, Sherlock Holmes, just in case anybody didn't know that.
Yes. Well, quite. Yeah. It's a bit harder to revive him than it was Sherlock Holmes. You couldn't just say, well, really. Well, I won't, actually, it's too many spoilers if I go into that, I suppose. But yeah. Right, now I've completely forgotten what I was going to say, so better feed me another question.
Okay, let me throw this out at you. So Paul and I do a lot of role-playing gaming, like with Gary Gygax's original game, and I know that you're not an expert on that. But among the things that is worked into the earliest version of that game, that's a real core part, and Paul and I love to work that into our performances, are intelligent swords. And we get like a surprising amount of traction from running intelligent swords as surprising aspects and things that are going to communicate possibly in a mysterious way with the players in unexpected ways. Was having a character be an inanimate, like a powerful sentient character being an inanimate object, how much did that drive the freshness and the weirdness of the Elric stories? And maybe so I think you got a little bit of the DNA from like Paul Anderson and things like that, but boy, you really established with Stormbringer something, a really powerful character who isn't a character at all. Are you happy with how that worked out?
I did. I mean, I've written about this, so it's not I'm not keeping it a secret. But Sigmund Freud had quite a lot to do with my planning of the Elric stories, as did Jung. When I was 19 when I started working out Elric, not 19. I think I was 21 when I sold the first story. But I was very, very interested in Freud and Jung, at that age, and so I was seeing a lot of symbolism in the stories, and the idea of being driven by some force, as it were, mysterious force, was not a particularly rare idea in either of those people. So there was a lot of the depth, I think, which it two reasons it probably has that sort of depth is, one, I was very familiar with the Gothic novel and the late 18th century, 19th century, what they called Bloods or Penny Dreadfuls, or which were pretty much all of them many of them had doomed heroes like Melmoth the Wanderer, and characters like that. So I did take. I took, I suppose, as much from the Gothic as I took from modern psychological writing, and I suppose, and then I of course merged them with my own youthful angst, which I had plenty of at that age, as we all do. I mean, and I suppose I don't want to make any sort of cheap connections between swords and penises, because although there is that element, and I discovered that was a very strong element. And you probably noticed a lot of swords in my titles. I found that books with sword in the title actually sold better than books without sword in the title. So it wasn't cynical. I mean, it was just a way of framing and structuring what I was trying to write about at the time. I mean, I used Elric, as I've used pretty much all of my books, not all of them, but pretty much all of them, to sort of explore elements of my own psyche, if you like. They're kind of, in that sense, again, a sort of reverse modernism that I've looked to symbolic ways of working out character and so on, and investigating character and that sort of thing. Sounds a bit pretentious. Sounds awful to me. I hope I don't have to repeat it.
I think we feel that, though. I think we do feel that, actually.
Well, I mean, I think that's not just me. I think you don't have to be as conscious a writer as I am to get that. I think also just the newness to me of the form. I mean, really, there really only were two or three writers of any note who were writing Howard type stories, and I wanted to do something as different. You know, I mean, I was commissioned to write the first Elric story, and I thought at first the editor had asked me to write a Conan story. As it happened, I had a Conan story of about 10,000 words that I'd already started to write for a magazine called Fantastic Universe, which was running Conan, or Conan by Spray de Camp and Lynn Carter and people like that. And I knew Spray de Camp at that time was the controller of the Howard estate, and so I had permission, and they wanted me to do it. But unfortunately, Fantastic Universe folded before I could finish the story, so I just put it aside and forgot about it. So when I was first asked to write a story in that sort of tradition, the sword and sorcery story, though I don't think that name existed at that particular moment, Fritz Leiber came up with that. I thought he said he wanted a Howard story, as it were, but he'd only wanted a Howard type story. So I decided that given the opportunity, I'd write something as different within the same genre, but as different from Howard as it was possible to get. So it was at that point that I diverged from the sort of standard sword and sorcery. And I had the Eternal Champion story already partially written before that. So I had it was all a bit vague. I had bits of Hawkmoon partially written as well around that time, all bits that I'd been just thought of and then set aside. So that when the time came for me to be doing it, I already had a fairly complex structure for way of writing the stories.
Well, we are really glad that you took it in a fresh direction.
Me too.
Yeah, absolutely. Gentlemen, we are about out of time here. So, Dan, do you have any final thoughts any final questions you wanted to get out, or shall we wrap things up?
I'll give it to Michael if there's anything else that we should know about your writing, or things that are coming out that we should look for. We would love to know about that, Michael.
No, I mean, I've got, as I say, I'm writing the Wounds of Albion, which is the last of the Whitefriars books. That has a lot in it about how I came to write certain things as well, because it is partially autobiography. So there's quite a lot about myself and the New World's days and how I came to write certain things and routines that I followed while I did write them. So if you want to skip the bits that bore you, probably the most informative here and there anyway. There's also a lot of absurdism, which is really what Jerry Cornelius is. So it's really a kind of compendium of all my different kinds of books in one, which is probably why it's my last full-length novel anyway, which I think is fair enough. It'll come out when I'm 85 or so. And I had a letter the other day from a guy who I like, a writer I like, but I'd never communicated with, who wrote back to me saying, "I thought you were dead," which I think is
No.
which I've actually had since I was about 30, because when I remember I was on stage with Hawkwind one time, and I thought people were saying you ought to be dead, but what they were saying was, we thought you were dead, because I wrote a dedication in a book saying that I died in I think 1980, 1970, and because in a way I had, it was to mark a personal change in what I was writing, but a lot of people took it literally, and so I've really been dead for about 50 years. It's quite a liberating way of living, really. I mean, constantly popping up, and haunting somebody.
Well done.
Yes, well, I hope to be doing it for another 100 years or so. I mean, we'll see.
We hope the same thing. We hope the same thing, Michael.
Thank you. Right. Well, let's hope the books don't get too boring after 100 years. I don't think I can keep it up. I have got another book coming out with Mark Hodder called, I think it's called The Albino's Secret, and it's I've been using Elric in his in a former incarnation. I mean, I took Elric from another writer called Anthony Skene, he was a detective villain, in an old pulp series, and we're now writing about that villain, that Elric, but with a lot of Elric symbolism in the stories. They're more or less modern stories. It's a series I call them the Metatemporal Detective, and it's about a detective who moves about in time, usually some significant moment in history. He's doing something. So we've got the albino. He's still back, and I think Mark's doing a really good job. So I think if I cough it tomorrow, Mark will be able to carry on writing, if not about Elric, at least about Elric's big brother.
Our viewers are saying right now that they want to read it as soon as possible.
Well, it's coming out.
So we expect you to be there.
Schuster. Yeah, I hope so. Yeah. Okay, yeah, Simon Schuster, I think, are doing it next year. So let's hope. And there's another one we've nearly finished. So we're I'd forgotten I was doing collaborations. That's what I'm doing now, and rather than got somebody else to do the work. Very, 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 very easy now. Anyway, it's been good talking to you, and I hope we can do it again sometime.
We would love that. That would be the best thing, Michael. We would love it.
Yeah, great. Okay, good. Well, I'd be curious to see the multiverse. Explain or attempt to explain the multiverse in the new Titan edition. I already did it in one, but this is a slightly changed introduction. And I'd be curious to hear from a mathematician whether it sounds like balderdash or not, because I am not a mathematician. I can't do long division.
Now, Michael, I'm going to dig into that heavily, and you'll get my feedback on exactly that.
All right, great.
I've been challenged.
I look forward to it. Okay, thanks a lot. Well, I'll say cheerio now, and and thanks everybody for listening. And if you do have any special questions, that aren't answered on one of my Facebook sites, then by all means, send them along, and I'll do my best to answer them in an email.
Fantastic.
Okay.
Excellent. So, viewers, if you have questions that went unanswered, please leave some comments here in the YouTube video, and we'll if we can get Michael on the show again in the future, which we would love. Maybe we can discuss those more down the road.
Okay, great.
And remember, you can follow, and subscribe to us, the Wandering DMs. We're on YouTube, Twitch, Facebook, GitHub, TikTok. We have the handle Wandering DMs and all those sites. So please strike that like button.
If you prefer to listen to our show in audio-only podcast format, you can find our podcasts on our website at wanderingdms.com. Also, there are various podcast carriers like iTunes, Spotify, Pocket Cast. If you're listening to the show right now on one of those sites and it provides the ability to do so, please rate and review our show. That helps other listeners find us, and we really appreciate it.
We really do, and I got to thank our patrons who support the show here every week. If you'd like to join them, please visit patreon.com/wanderingdms, and all of our tiers get you access to our Discord server, and Paul and I continue the live chat in about 10 minutes there every Sunday, which we'll be talking more about the works of Michael Moorcock in just a couple minutes. I'll be back Thursday night for more of Dan's Old Time Minis show at 9 p.m. Eastern Time. Next week we'll actually be off because we are wandering to a gaming convention next week. So we'll be off, but we'll be back in 2 weeks. So again, huge thanks to Michael Moorcock. We would love to have you on again. Good luck finishing your novel. And thank you so much for the time today, Michael.
Thank you very much too. I enjoyed it. Thank you.
That's the best. We're live about every Sunday at 1 p.m. Eastern Time. So please join us again in 2 weeks for another thought-provoking discussion.
So we'll see you then. Bye, everyone.